The thing about guarding a diplomatic vessel carrying the alien queen and her daughters, Lieutenant Marcus Webb reflected while trying to extract himself from yet another formal reception, was that everyone treated it like some kind of sacred honor, when really it was just extremely boring, punctuated by brief moments of intense anxiety about protocol violations. He'd been part of the human delegation for 6 days, had attended 4 formal dinners, 2 cultural presentations, and 1 musical performance that had lasted 3 hours and featured instruments that produced sounds his ears weren't designed to hear to process comfortably. His official role was Junior Military Liaison, which translated to stand in the background looking professional while senior officers do actual diplomacy. The reception finally wound down around 0200 ship time, and Marcus escaped to his assigned quarters with the relief of someone fleeing a natural disaster. The quarters were generous by military standards: private sleeping area, small workspace, actual bathroom instead of a shared facility, though decorated in the flowing organic aesthetic the aliens favored that made everything look slightly alive. He'd gotten used to walls that seemed to breathe and furniture that adjusted to his presence, though he still found the bioluminescent lighting unsettling when he woke up at odd hours. He was halfway through changing into something less formal when his door chimed with the pattern that indicated a visitor. Marcus checked the time, 0247, and wondered who would be visiting at this hour. Probably another security check. They'd been doing random inspections since the delegation arrived, making sure the humans weren't accessing restricted areas or attempting to gather intelligence beyond what the trade negotiations covered. He opened the door and found himself looking down at 2 small aliens who barely reached his waist, both wearing what appeared to be sleeping robes, and both staring up at him with the kind of intense focus that small children across species seem to specialize in. Marcus's brain took approximately 3 seconds to place them: the Queen's daughters, the ones who'd been presented at the formal introduction ceremony, and who he'd been specifically instructed to avoid interacting with, unless absolutely necessary for diplomatic purposes. Marcus said, demonstrating the eloquence that had surely contributed to his selection for this mission. Hello. The older one, Neveth, he remembered from the briefing, spoke in accented but clear standard. You are the human who told the story about the animal that steals food. Marcus had to think back through 6 days of careful diplomatic interaction before placing the reference. During one of the receptions, he'd been cornered by a minor official's children and had ended up telling them about raccoons, which had somehow evolved into an animated description of the time a raccoon had broken into his childhood home and stolen an entire pizza. The kids had found it hilarious, and apparently word had spread. The raccoon story, yeah, that was me. He looked past them into the empty corridor. Where are your guards? Does someone know you're here? The younger one, Syrah, shook her head. Kelrus is sleeping. We came to hear more stories. Marcus felt his career prospects flash before his eyes as he processed the fact that he was having an unsupervised conversation with alien royalty in his quarters at nearly 3 in the morning. Every diplomatic protocol he'd been briefed on was currently being violated, and he had approximately 30 seconds to figure out how to handle this before it became an incident. Okay, so your guards definitely should know where you are. That's pretty important. How about we go find them and— We don't want to go back yet, Navith interrupted. The guards never talk to us. They just stand there being serious. You're more interesting. I'm really not. I'm extremely boring. Ask anyone on my ship, they'll confirm. Marcus glanced down the corridor again, expecting security to appear any moment. Listen, I appreciate the visit, but you being here without permission is going to cause problems. Big problems. The kind that get people in trouble. Syrah looked up at him with an expression that transcended species boundaries to achieve universal, small child about to be disappointed. Just one more story? Marcus stood in his doorway at 0250 ship time, looking at 2 alien princesses who should absolutely not be in his quarters, and made the kind of decision that would either be a minor diplomatic hiccup or a career-ending catastrophe depending on how the next few minutes played out. He could march them back to their quarters immediately, which was clearly the correct protocol following response, or he could tell them one quick story, keep them entertained for 5 minutes, and then escort them back before anyone noticed they'd gone missing. He chose option 2, which in retrospect was definitely the wrong choice, but seemed reasonable at the time. Fine, one story, then we're going straight back to your quarters, and you're going to forget this happened. He stepped aside to let them in, and both princesses immediately made themselves comfortable on his sleeping area, with the unself-conscious ease of children who'd never learned to doubt their welcome anywhere. Tell us about more earth animals, Navith requested. Strange ones. Strange earth animals. Okay. Marcus sat in his desk chair and tried to remember which animal stories were appropriate for children who might or might not understand human cultural context. There's this bird called a cassowary. Big, can't fly, has this thing on its head that looks like a helmet, and feet that could literally kill you. Lives in Australia, which is a place where everything is trying to murder you anyway, so the cassowary fits right in. Why would a bird want to murder anyone? Sierra asked. Territorial defense, mostly. Though honestly, Australian wildlife doesn't always need reasons. There are spiders there the size of your face, snakes that can kill you 17 different ways, and jellyfish that are so venomous that just touching their tentacles can stop your heart. Both princesses looked appropriately horrified and fascinated. Naveth leaned forward. And humans choose to live there? Millions of them. They call it home. Build cities, raise families, go to the beach where the murder jellyfish live. Marcus was warming to the topic now, remembering his brief deployment to Darwin and the very educational safety briefing about local wildlife. There's this octopus, tiny thing, really pretty blue rings, and it's one of the most venomous creatures on the planet. No antivenom. If it bites you, you just have to hope someone can keep you breathing until the toxin wears off. Earth sounds dangerous, Sierra observed. Parts of it are. Other parts are safer. Though we did have this thing during the late Anthropocene where we'd accidentally introduce species to places they didn't belong, and they'd take over entire ecosystems. Like rabbits in Australia, someone brought a few for hunting, and suddenly there were millions of them eating everything. He continued with animal stories, moving from Australia's nightmare fauna to deep-sea creatures that looked like aliens themselves, to the disputed reports of Bigfoot sightings that had persisted for centuries, despite complete lack of evidence. The princesses listened with the kind of focused attention that children reserve for subjects they found genuinely interesting, asking questions and requesting clarification on details that Marcus hadn't thought about in years. Somewhere around 3:20, he noticed that Sierra's questions were becoming less frequent, and by 3:30 she'd curled up on his sleeping area and appeared to have dozed off. Naveth was still listening, but fighting to keep her eyes open, and Marcus realized he should probably wrap this up and get them back to their quarters before their absence was noticed. Okay, story time is over. We need to get you two back before your guards panic. He stood up, preparing to wake Sierra gently. Naveth yawned, showing teeth that were sharper than human standard. Can we stay a little longer? It's comfortable here. It's definitely not appropriate for you to stay here. Come on, up we go. But when he tried to wake Sierra, she just mumbled something unintelligible and curled tighter into the sleeping area. And Marcus was suddenly faced with the problem of how to move a sleeping alien child without causing a diplomatic incident. He looked at Naveth, who was also showing signs of imminent unconsciousness. Your guards are going to lose their minds, Marcus said, more to himself than to her. Kelris won't wake up for hours. She took her sleep medication. Naveth's eyes were closing. We'll go back before morning attendance. And then she was asleep too, leaving Marcus standing in his quarters at 03:35 ship time with two unconscious alien princesses who absolutely should not be there, and no clear plan for resolving the situation that wouldn't create massive problems. He could try to wake them and force them to return, which felt wrong on multiple levels. He could alert security immediately, which would be the proper protocol but would also probably result in everyone panicking. Or he could let them sleep for a bit, keep watch, and escort them back before their morning schedule began. He chose option 3, which was definitely the wrong choice, but seemed more humane than the alternatives. He grabbed his datapad, settled into his desk chair, and pulled up the trade agreement documents he was supposed to be reviewing anyway. At least he could be productive while waiting for this situation to resolve itself, and if anyone asked later, he could truthfully say he'd maintained constant supervision. The alarm that cut through the ship's systems at 0347 suggested that his plan had some significant flaws he probably should have anticipated. Queen Sesseth had been awakened by emergency alarms before, twice during attempted coups, once during a reactor malfunction, and memorably during what turned out to be a false sensor reading that someone had explained away as equipment failure, though she'd always suspected incompetence. None of those experiences had prepared her for being woken at 0347 with the news that her daughters had vanished from their secured quarters and their guardian had been found unconscious with signs of neural suppression. She was in the security center within 4 minutes, still wearing her sleep robes because some situations didn't allow time for proper royal presentation, and the assembled officers were radiating the kind of barely controlled panic that suggested they understood exactly how severe this situation could become. Captain Theron stood at the central display, coordinating search patterns with the kind of intense focus that people adopted when their careers were actively burning down around them. "Report," Sesseth said, her voice carrying the flat calm that her species used when experiencing emotions too dangerous to express. Princesses Navith and Sira were discovered missing at 0347 during routine attendance check. Their guardian, Kelrus, was found unconscious outside their quarters with elevated levels of somnithine in her system, a neural suppressant that requires medical-grade synthesis. No signs of forced entry to the royal quarters. No unauthorized access to restricted areas. Bioscanners are not detecting the princesses anywhere on the vessel. Theron's hands moved across the display, highlighting search zones. "We've implemented full lockdown. All personnel are being located and verified. The human delegation has been confined to quarters under guard pending investigation. You suspect human involvement." It wasn't a question. "We're not ruling anything out, Your Majesty. The timing is suspicious. Princesses go missing during a diplomatic visit. Their guardian is drugged with a compound that suggests premeditation. We need to consider all possibilities." Sesseth watched the search patterns update on the display, watched her security forces systematically sweep through every compartment while her daughters remained undetected, and felt the cold certainty that something terrible had happened settling into her chest. Her species had enemies, rivals who would see her daughters as leverage or targets, and the fact that this had occurred during a diplomatic visit suggested planning that went beyond random opportunism. "Have you questioned the humans?" she asked. "Ambassador Chen has requested permission to assist with the search. I've denied pending security clearance." Theron looked uncomfortable. "Your Majesty, if the humans are involved, alerting them to our search parameters could compromise recovery efforts. And if they're not involved, we're creating a diplomatic incident while my daughters are missing. Weigh those priorities carefully, Captain." Sesseth moved to the display, examining the search zones. "What about areas the scanners can't penetrate? Shielded compartments? Storage areas?" "We're doing manual sweeps of those locations now. It's slower but thorough." Theron highlighted several sections. "We've cleared 60% of the vessel. No sign of the princesses or any indication of unauthorized activity." Mirith, her senior advisor, appeared at her elbow with a kind of quiet presence that suggested she'd been there for several minutes, waiting for acknowledgement. "Your Majesty, I've reviewed the security logs. There's no record of the princesses leaving their quarters. The door was sealed from the inside, and Kelrus's biometrics show she was outside when the somnithine took effect. Someone drugged her, entered the royal quarters without triggering alarms, removed both my daughters without leaving traces, and vanished within a sealed vessel." Sesseth heard her own voice carrying the edge that made people nervous. That level of capability suggests either catastrophic security failure or inside assistance. "We're investigating both possibilities. All security personnel are being rescreened. Access logs are being analyzed for anomalies." Mirith paused. "Your Majesty, if I may, there's another possibility we should consider." "Speak. What if the princesses left voluntarily? What if they weren't taken but went somewhere on their own?" Theron looked skeptical. "They're 7 and 5. How would they know how to bypass security protocols?" "They wouldn't need to bypass them if they simply walked out while Kelrus was incapacitated. The door was sealed from inside, but anyone inside could unseal it." Mirith gestured to the display. "If they left on their own, they might not register as a security threat. They might have accessed areas we haven't considered because we're searching for intruders, not wandering children. Sesseth considered this. Her daughters were curious, prone to exploring when they thought no one was watching, and certainly clever enough to take advantage of an opportunity if presented. But that didn't explain the somnathine in Kelris's system or where two small children could hide in a vessel being systematically searched. Expand the search parameters, she ordered. Include areas the children could access on their own. Storage compartments, maintenance corridors, anywhere they might consider interesting. She turned to Theron. And send someone to question Lieutenant Webb, the junior human liaison. Theron looked confused. He's not senior enough to be involved in anything significant. My daughters met him briefly at the cultural reception. Navith mentioned he told them a story about Earth animals. If they decided to go exploring, they might have sought him out. It was a thin possibility, but Sesseth was currently operating on the principle that any lead was better than standing in the security center, watching search patterns update while her children remained missing. 20 minutes later, the junior security officer's report came through, and Sesseth felt the world tilt slightly as she processed the information. Her daughters had been found. They were unharmed. They were asleep in the humans' quarters, and Lieutenant Webb was sitting there reading something on a datapad, like this was a completely normal situation. She was moving before the report finished, Mareth struggling to keep pace as Sesseth navigated through corridors with the single-minded focus of a mother who just discovered her missing children were sleeping in an alien's bed for reasons that made absolutely no sense. Security forces scrambled to follow, creating an armed procession that would either rescue her daughters or create the most awkward diplomatic incident in recent history. The humans' quarters were in the delegation section, door unsealed and showing Lieutenant Webb sitting in a chair, looking remarkably calm for someone who technically committed what could be interpreted as kidnapping royalty. He looked up as the doorway filled with armed security and one extremely dangerous queen, and his response was to raise one finger to his lips in a gesture that apparently meant, "Be quiet," in human body language. Sesseth stopped in the doorway, her prepared accusations dying as she saw her daughters curled up on the human sleeping area, genuinely and peacefully asleep in a way that children only achieved when they felt completely safe. Around her, security was preparing to extract the princesses and detain the human, but she raised one hand to halt them because something about this situation didn't match the kidnapping scenario she'd been preparing for. "Lieutenant Webb," she said quietly, her voice carrying enough edge that he'd understand this was not a casual conversation. "Explain why my daughters are sleeping in your quarters." Marcus had approximately 3 seconds to decide how to handle being confronted by an alien queen surrounded by armed security while her daughters slept peacefully on his bed. And he chose honesty because everything else seemed likely to make the situation worse. He stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible, and tried to project the kind of calm competence that might prevent immediate execution. "They showed up at my door around 0250 asking for stories. I told them one, they fell asleep, and I've been keeping watch while trying to figure out the least problematic way to return them before anyone noticed." He paused. That plan clearly had some flaws I didn't anticipate. The queen stared at him with an expression he couldn't interpret, and Marcus was acutely aware that he was one wrong word away from a diplomatic disaster that would probably end his career and possibly his life. Around her, the security forces were maintaining ready positions, and he noticed several of them had weapons that looked more sophisticated than standard sidearms. "They came to your quarters voluntarily," the queen said, her tone suggesting she was testing the statement for plausibility. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't invite them. I didn't even know they were coming. They just showed up and asked for stories about Earth animals." Marcus gestured toward the still sleeping princesses. "I figured telling them one story and then escorting them back was better than arguing in the corridor where someone might see them. In retrospect, that was questionable judgment on my part." One of the security officers moved forward, clearly intending to extract the children, but the queen raised her hand again to stop them. She was staring at her daughters with an expression that had shifted from anger to something more complicated, something that might have been confusion or possibly revelation. "In my species," the queen said quietly, "sleep location is instinctive. Children only rest where they sense absolute safety, where their unconscious minds detect no threat or danger. It's not a conscious choice. It's fundamental to our biology. She looked at Marcus. My daughters have known you for less than 3 days, yet they sought you out specifically, entered your quarters without fear, and chose to sleep here. Marcus processed this information and arrived at the conclusion that he'd accidentally stumbled into something culturally significant that he had absolutely no framework for understanding. I didn't know that. They didn't mention it. I just told them stories and tried to keep them out of trouble. How did you treat them? When they were here, what did you do? Told them about earth animals, cassowaries, jellyfish, that octopus with the blue rings that can kill you. They seemed interested, asked questions. Then they got tired and fell asleep. Marcus was aware this sounded completely inadequate as an explanation for whatever cultural significance the Queen was attributing to the situation. I was going to wake them and escort them back, but they were genuinely asleep, and it felt wrong to force them awake just to avoid protocol violations. The Queen's physician had entered and was scanning the sleeping princesses with handheld equipment. After a moment, she looked up at the Queen with visible surprise. No neural suppressants, no signs of coercion or distress. They're sleeping naturally, Your Majesty. Deep rest cycle, completely voluntary. The Queen absorbed this information, and Marcus watched her expression shift through several emotions he didn't have names for before settling on something that looked almost like amusement, though he couldn't be certain across species boundaries. Lieutenant Webb, do you understand what you've done? She asked. Committed multiple protocol violations and probably ended my diplomatic career, Marcus offered. You've become the first non-familial individual my daughters have trusted enough to sleep beside in their entire lives. That's not insignificant. The Queen gestured to her security forces. Stand down. This isn't a kidnapping. It's apparently a cultural revelation I wasn't prepared for. The security forces looked uncertain but obeyed, weapons lowering though they maintained ready positions. The physician continued her scans, confirming repeatedly that both princesses were unharmed and sleeping normally, which seemed to be the most surprising finding possible. Your Majesty, one of the senior security officers said carefully, the guardian, Kelris. She was drugged. Someone administered somnithine. I'm aware. That's still a security concern that needs investigation. The Queen looked at Marcus. Did you see anyone near the royal quarters? Anyone who might have had access? I didn't leave my quarters after the reception ended. Just changed, was doing some work. Then your daughter showed up. Marcus tried to remember if he'd heard anything unusual. The corridor was quiet when they arrived. No one else around that I noticed. We should review corridor security footage, the physician suggested. If someone drugged Kelris to create an opportunity, there will be evidence. The investigation shifted focus, security forces moving to analyze footage and chemical traces, while Marcus remained in his quarters with 2 sleeping princesses and 1 alien queen who was examining him with the kind of intense scrutiny that made him extremely uncomfortable. He sat back down in his chair, trying to project calm while internally panicking about the diplomatic implications of the situation. You didn't treat them like royalty, the Queen observed. I didn't really think about it. They were just kids asking for stories. I've got younger cousins back home. You don't treat kids like they're special. You just talk to them like normal people. Marcus paused. Was I supposed to treat them differently? Most people do. Guards stand at attention. Courtiers bow. Even their tutors maintain formal distance. You just told them stories about animals and let them fall asleep. The Queen's expression suggested she was still processing this. They feel safe with you, safe enough to become completely vulnerable, to trust you with their unconscious selves. That's not something that can be commanded or faked. It's instinctive recognition of protection. I'm not trying to protect anything. I just didn't want them to get in trouble for wandering around unsupervised. That's protection, Lieutenant. You saw children who needed supervision and provided it without thinking about protocol or personal consequence. That's exactly the quality they responded to. The Queen was quiet for a moment. I'm going to have to rethink several assumptions I'd made about human-alien interaction dynamics. The security investigation eventually revealed that Kelris had indeed been drugged, but by one of her own people, a junior attendant who'd hoped to advance her position by exposing security flaws. The plan had been to drug Kelris, make it look like a breach, and position herself as the more vigilant guardian. She hadn't counted on the princesses actually leaving or on them choosing to sleep in a human's quarters, which complicated her narrative considerably. By 0600, the crisis had been downgraded from potential kidnapping to internal security matter, and Marcus was left exhausted in his quarters while the Queen arranged for her daughters to be quietly returned to their own rooms. Before she left, she paused in his doorway. "Lieutenant Webb, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Yes, ma'am. If my daughters came to your quarters again, would you turn them away?" Marcus considered the question and the diplomatic implications and decided honesty was probably safer than whatever careful political answer he might construct. "Probably not. I'd try to convince them to stay in their own quarters. But if they showed up asking for stories, I'd probably tell them stories. They're kids. They shouldn't be turned away just because it's inconvenient." The Queen nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say. We're going to need to have a longer conversation about this, but not at 0600 after a security crisis. For now, try to get some rest. And Lieutenant?" "Yes, ma'am? Thank you for keeping them safe, even though you didn't realize you were doing it." Then she was gone, and Marcus was alone in his quarters, trying to process the fact that he'd accidentally become significant to alien royalty through the simple act of telling stories and not being an asshole to children who wanted someone to talk to. His datapad chimed with a message from Ambassador Chen. "My office, 0800. Bring detailed explanation of whatever the hell just happened." Marcus groaned and decided that sleep was probably not happening before that conversation. He'd accidentally stumbled into cultural significance, violated multiple protocols, and somehow avoided getting executed for kidnapping royalty. All before breakfast. The universe, he reflected, had a really peculiar sense of humor. The conversation with Ambassador Chen was exactly as uncomfortable as Marcus had anticipated, featuring multiple variations of, "What were you thinking?" and "Do you understand how badly this could have gone?" Marcus accepted the lecture with the resignation of someone who knew he'd made questionable decisions and couldn't actually defend them beyond, "It seemed like the right thing to do at the time." "You're extremely lucky," the Queen interpreted this as cultural exchange rather than protocol violation, Chen said after 20 minutes of detailed explanation of everything Marcus had done wrong. "If she'd decided you were a threat to her children, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." "I'm aware, sir. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." Dismissed. Marcus returned to his quarters expecting to spend the rest of the day avoiding anyone important and trying to pretend he was useful to the diplomatic mission. But at 1400 he received a message requesting his presence at the Queen's private chambers for what was described as informal discussion. This was either a good sign or a very bad sign, and Marcus honestly couldn't tell which. The Queen's chambers were significantly more elaborate than his quarters, all flowing organic architecture and bioluminescent features that created an atmosphere somewhere between royal palace and living organism. The Queen herself was waiting in what appeared to be a sitting area, and she gestured for him to join her with the kind of casual authority that suggested this wasn't going to be a formal diplomatic exchange. "Lieutenant Webb, thank you for coming. Didn't really feel like I had a choice, ma'am." "You always have a choice, though in this case, refusing would have been diplomatically awkward." She indicated a seat that adjusted to his presence as he sat. "I wanted to discuss what happened last night, away from security officers and diplomatic observers and people who will interpret everything through political frameworks." "All right, what do you want to know? Why did you let them stay? You knew it was inappropriate. You understood the protocol violations. Yet you chose to supervise them rather than immediately return them or alert security. Why?" Marcus had been thinking about this question since the whole situation began, and he still didn't have a particularly sophisticated answer. Because they were tired, they felt safe, and forcing them awake just to avoid paperwork felt cruel. "I figured I could keep watch, make sure nothing happened to them, and escort them back before anyone noticed." The plan had flaws, obviously, but the alternative was prioritizing protocol over their comfort, and that felt wrong. The Queen was quiet for a moment, and Marcus couldn't tell if he'd given the right answer or just confirmed that he was hopelessly naive about diplomatic realities. In my culture, she said finally, we place enormous emphasis on protection of children, not just physical safety, but emotional security, the sense that they're valued and cared for. It's instinctive, deeply embedded in our biology. When my daughters chose to sleep in your quarters, they were demonstrating trust at a fundamental level that cannot be commanded or manufactured. They recognized you as safe, as protective, as someone who would prioritize their well-being over convenience. I just didn't want them to get in trouble. That's exactly my point. You saw children who needed someone to care whether they were safe and comfortable, and you provided that without calculating political advantage or personal benefit. That's rare, Lieutenant, especially in diplomatic contexts where every interaction is analyzed for strategic implications. She paused. My daughters have dozens of guards, attendants, tutors, all of them highly trained, completely loyal, dedicated to their protection. Yet none of them have ever achieved the level of trust that you somehow established in one evening of telling stories about Earth animals. Maybe because I wasn't trying to establish anything. I was just talking to them. Yes, that's precisely why it worked. The Queen stood and moved to a viewing panel that showed the star field outside. I've been thinking about what this means. My daughters instinctively trust you more than people who've been part of their lives for years. That suggests something about the difference between formal protection and genuine care. Between duty and, I'm not sure what the right word is. Presence, perhaps. Marcus wasn't entirely sure where this conversation was going, but he had a growing sense that it was leading somewhere significant. Your Majesty, if you're asking whether I'd be willing to help with your daughters in some official capacity, I should mention that I'm completely unqualified for anything involving royal childcare. I'm not asking you to become their official guardian. I'm asking if you'd be willing to continue being exactly what you were last night, someone who treats them like children rather than royalty, who tells them stories and lets them feel normal for a few hours. She turned to face him. They need that, more than I realized until I saw them sleeping peacefully in your quarters, more relaxed than I've ever seen them in formal settings. You want me to be their, unofficial storyteller? I want you to be their friend if you're willing, someone they can visit who won't treat every interaction like a diplomatic negotiation, someone who sees them as Naveth and Sirah rather than Princess First and Princess Second. The Queen's expression carried something that might have been hope or might have been uncertainty. It's an unusual request, I know, but after last night, I can't ignore what they chose. They chose you without prompting or command. That means something in my culture. Marcus considered the implications of becoming somehow integrated into alien royal family dynamics, weighed the diplomatic complications against the memory of two small kids asking questions about cassowaries, and made a decision that was probably going to complicate his life significantly. I can do that. Tell them stories, answer questions, let them feel normal. I can't promise I'll be good at it, but I can try. That's all I'm asking. The Queen's relief was visible. You'll need security clearance, obviously, and there will be protocols about visitation and supervision. But the core of it, being someone they trust, that can't be protocoled. It just has to be genuine. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself integrated into a routine he'd never anticipated. The princesses would visit his quarters every few days, always supervised now by guards who'd been briefed on the arrangement and who stood outside maintaining security while Marcus told stories about Earth, answered questions about human culture, and occasionally helped with homework assignments that seemed designed to be confusing across species boundaries. He learned that Navith was interested in biology and wanted to know everything about Earth ecosystems, while Sirah was fascinated by human historical conflicts and kept asking questions about wars that Marcus had to carefully answer without making humanity look either too violent or too incompetent. He learned which stories they found funny, which ones scared them in the good way that children enjoyed being scared, and which topics they'd already learned about from their tutors and wanted deeper explanation of. The Queen observed occasionally, watching her daughters interact with the human who'd accidentally become significant to them, and Marcus noticed she seemed more relaxed during those visits than in any formal diplomatic context. Once, after a particularly animated discussion about why humans had domesticated wolves into dogs, She'd commented that her daughters smiled more in his quarters than anywhere else, and Marcus hadn't known how to respond except to keep telling stories. The trade negotiations concluded successfully, creating frameworks for cooperation that both species seemed genuinely pleased with, and the human delegation prepared to depart. On the final day, Marcus received a private summons to the Queen's chambers, and he arrived expecting some kind of formal thank you, or possibly a diplomatic gift he'd have to figure out how to transport. Instead, the Queen offered him a position as cultural liaison specifically assigned to her daughter's education, a role that would require him to transfer from military service to diplomatic corps, but would allow him to continue the relationship he'd accidentally created. "You don't have to accept," she said. "It's a significant life change, and I won't pressure you into it. But I wanted you to know the option exists if you want it." Marcus thought about returning to his previous role, filing reports and attending ceremonies and being professionally forgettable. Thought about two small aliens who trusted him enough to fall asleep in his quarters because he treated them like normal kids instead of untouchable royalty. Thought about the fact that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones you made without fully understanding the implications. "I'll need to discuss it with my command. But yeah, I'm interested. More than interested, actually." The Queen smiled, and Marcus realized it was the first time he'd seen her expression carry genuine warmth rather than diplomatic courtesy. "Good. My daughters will be pleased. They've already asked when you're visiting next, and I had to explain you were leaving, which resulted in expressions I'm told are not appropriate for diplomatic settings. They're good kids. They deserve someone who sees them that way." "Yes, they do. And somehow, through protocol violation and accidental cultural exchange, they found that person in a human lieutenant who couldn't read ceremonial glyphs properly." She paused. "The universe has an interesting sense of narrative timing." Marcus left the meeting with preliminary transfer documents and the slightly surreal awareness that he'd accidentally stumbled into a role that mattered more than anything he'd originally been assigned to do. He'd shown up expecting boring diplomatic theater, and was leaving having become significant to alien royalty through the simple act of telling stories and not treating children like political assets. His final message to Ambassador Chen, explaining his transfer request, ended with a line that he suspected would be quoted in diplomatic training for years. "Turns out the most important qualification for cross-cultural cooperation is just treating people like people, even when they're princesses who can technically have you executed." Chen's response came back within an hour. "Transfer approved. Try not to cause any more diplomatic incidents. Though given your track record, I'm not optimistic." Marcus packed his quarters, said goodbye to the delegation members who'd become familiar over weeks of travel, and prepared to begin a career he'd never planned for with an alien family who'd chosen to trust him for reasons he still didn't entirely understand. The princesses visited one final time before his transfer was processed, officially to say goodbye, but actually to make sure he was definitely coming back. He assured them he was, told them one more story about the time a moose had chased his uncle through a parking lot in Manitoba, and watched them fall asleep on his sleeping area one last time before their guards gently woke them for return to their own quarters. After they left, Marcus sat in his empty quarters and reflected on the strange path that had led from protocol violation to cultural significance. He'd treated two alien children like normal kids asking for stories, and they'd trusted him enough to sleep beside him, and somehow that simple act had become the foundation for something that mattered more than any formal diplomatic achievement. The universe, he decided, had a peculiar way of making important moments out of small choices. And sometimes the most significant thing you could do was just be present when children needed someone who saw them as worth protecting, even when you didn't fully understand what that protection meant.